Thanks. So the talk will assume that you know nothing about involuntary civil commitment. And I will tell you in about 3 quick sentences everything that you do need to know about it before we really get to the heart of the reason I wanted to talk today. So every one of the 50 states has a law that under which people are involuntarily committed to psychiatric hospitals, public and private. The standards and procedures for involuntary commitment of people with serious mental illnesses to public and private hospitals vary tremendously by state, including what must be proven, what procedural protections are available to persons facing involuntary commitment, how long the commitment will last, etc. And then a word of sort of background constitutional law. The Supreme Court has said that involuntary commitment to a psychiatric hospital is a massive deprivation of liberty. They said this about 3 decades ago and have repeated that phrase over and over again, and therefore have said that such a commitment must be afforded procedural protections to guarantee that someone's liberty is not taken away inappropriately. But the court's standards on this are, I think you can objectively say, vague and low. So states have a great deal of flexibility above the floor set by the United States Supreme Court and other courts in deciding what the standard is for involuntary commitment. That's all you need to know. So the puzzle that led me to want to talk today and to wrestle with this issue is that about 4 years ago in Illinois, a group of people pushed through a change in our commitment standard, lowering that commitment standard, and therefore making it easier to involuntarily commit someone to a psychiatric hospital, public or private. And the goal of that lowering of the commitment standard, which was not a huge change in the standard, but was a change in the standard, was to get people committed who weren't being committed under the then existing law. So that's fairly straightforward. And the puzzle is that in the years since that change occurred, the number of people who have been involuntarily committed in Illinois has declined. And so the question is, why is that? And it might not matter much if Illinois is a wacky state in many regards. Those of you who live here or just have moved here for a while may have noticed that we still don't have our legislature, which was supposed to be done on June 1st, is still in session, and by my watch, it's long past June 1st. So the fact that Illinois is a little wacky might not be of any particular interest to anyone, but this is part of a larger national trend, which I think one needs to think about and think about its meaning and effect. And that is, in the 60s and 70s, consistently, not in every state, but in most states, the legislature raised the standard for involuntary commitment for people with mental illness. And recently in the 1990s and continuing into 2007 and indeed into 2008, the commitment standard in many jurisdictions have been lowered. And this has been a bone of contention between, I would say, warring camps of large groups that are arrayed around the issue of whether we should be making it easier or more difficult to involuntarily commit people. So why is it that the commitment standard lowering, which occurred 4 years ago in Illinois, hasn't resulted in more people being committed? Indeed, I can tell you that the number of people who were involuntarily committed in Illinois had been declining for years and just continued that long decline. So here are some numbers about the history, which I think may help us to understand the role of involuntary commitment and, more importantly, the role of an involuntary commitment standard in thinking about how the mental health system actually functions and whether or not we are going to send more people voluntarily or involuntarily to psychiatric hospitals. So the gross number of people confined in psychiatric hospitals in this country peaked in the 1950s. Since then, it has steadily declined. Here are some numbers from Illinois, which I think is fairly typical in this regard, if not in any other. In 1952, there were 55,000 state psychiatric hospital beds. 55,000 beds available in state psychiatric hospitals in 1952. Currently, there are 1,400. Okay, so that's over a 95% reduction in the number of state psychiatric hospital beds. You may have figured out that our population has not stayed the same from 1950. It hasn't quite doubled, but almost. So that if we were putting people in state psychiatric hospitals at the same rate today that we were doing it in the 1950s, one would assume we would need at least 100,000 beds. That would be the equivalent to the 55,000 beds that we had in the 1950s. So what is the explanation for this long, slow decline from 55,000 state psychiatric hospital beds to 1,400, a decline which, again, has been reflected in every one of the 50 states and, indeed, the District of Columbia? The standard explanation goes like this. Civil libertarians and patient advocates convince courts, legislators, and others that involuntary commitment was a substantial deprivation of liberty and that psychiatric hospitals did more harm than good. This led to court decisions and legislation that required a heightened standard for involuntary commitment, which in turn led to a decline in the number of patients committed and a decline in the number of persons in psychiatric hospitals, public and private. That has been the standard explanation of what happened in the period between the 1950s and 2007, or any point in between then. It's that explanation which I think is almost completely wrong, and may explain why the lowering of the commitment standard a few years ago in Illinois and similar changes in other states has not led to an increase in the number of people committed or in the number of people confined, to the extent that there is a difference. And I'm going to offer some more likely explanations for the decline in involuntary commitments and the decline in inpatient psychiatric hospitalization. One is, and the most obvious one, and I think the one that has had the most force in making a change in how we use psychiatric hospitals, is that we have developed more effective medications, and that has enabled people with chronic, incurable mental illnesses to recover sufficiently so that they could be treated in the community. That really began in the 50s and has continued to this day. There are many problems with these medications, but they are much more effective than anything we had for the treatment of mental illness before the 50s, and they continue to improve, again, not without some problems. So it was possible to keep people who had incurable illnesses, but treatable illnesses like schizophrenia and bipolar affective disorder, perhaps the two most common diagnoses that lead to hospitalization. It's possible now to treat those illnesses in the community. A second factor, which I think is quite important, is the unionization of state and private hospital staff. That's important because it has dramatically driven up the cost of hospitalization. We now have to pay people a lot more money to take care of persons with mental illnesses in psychiatric hospitals. I personally benefited from this 102 years ago when I worked in a psychiatric hospital before I came to this law school. All of a sudden, the staff was unionized and my salary tripled overnight. I think it went up to $6 an hour. I was overpaid. So those costs make it harder to keep people in hospitals because you do have to have staff. A third thing, which I think was unintended, but in hindsight easily predictable, we enacted federal Medicaid legislation, which for the first time created a national funding for health care. And this was a massive new federal welfare program, which I suspect people in the room have wildly different views about it. whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, but essentially what it did was to create federal-state partnerships for the funding of health care for poor people. Essentially, it means that if a state chooses to have a Medicaid program, it must comply with certain federal regulations, and then the federal government will pay approximately, this varies, 50% of the costs of care for people who are getting health care services in the categories the federal government provides. Now, because the federal government was creating this massive new program, which has, even when it was created, cost a huge amount of money, and of course costs a lot more money now, they looked around and noticed that most states did not have hospitals for non-psychiatric illnesses, but every state had a state hospital system, and indeed a huge percentage of people with serious mental illnesses were in those state hospitals, and the state was paying for that hospitalization from its own revenue. And the federal government said, why should we all of a sudden subsidize these existing state health care programs? And so they carved out an exclusion, a statutory exclusion, which said that if you're in a state psychiatric hospital, the federal government will not allow you to be, the cost of your care to be covered by Medicaid. That is, they wouldn't throw in their 50 cents on every dollar. So if the state was spending $1 on you in a state psychiatric hospital, and it could figure out a strategy for treating you in some other location for your mental illness that was not a state psychiatric hospital or something that fit the definition that the federal government created, then all of a sudden, magically, not magically, but by statute, the 50 cents on the dollar contribution of the federal government kicked in. So if you're a state, you had a strong incentive to get people out of those psychiatric hospitals so that the cost of their care could be shared with federal taxpayers. And so you understand, if you're a state legislator, you think that all federal tax dollars are free. You might notice that although Medicaid is an optional federal program, no state has to have a Medicaid program. All 50 of the states do, because, of course, everyone in Illinois or everyone in Ohio is sending their federal tax dollars to pay for this program, and if Illinois chooses not to participate, they are foregoing all of that federal money to pay for the cost of care for people in Illinois. So there's a strong incentive to join this optional program if you want to get your money back that your taxpayers, your citizens, have sent to Washington. Another thing that has happened, and this you can blame or give credit to lawyers. My earlier suggestion was that lawyers were not the cause of, and civil libertarians were not the cause of this change. But there are two ways in which lawyers and civil libertarians might have contributed to the deinstitutionalization movement, to the movement of people out of state and private psychiatric hospitals. One is that there were suits and other pressures brought to bear against states to improve the conditions in state psychiatric hospitals. That is, have more staff, have the staff better trained, and provide a variety of other things to people in those hospitals. And of course, the obvious effect of improving the conditions of people in state psychiatric hospitals is that it costs more money. So if all of a sudden we say that you must have more staff in order to assure safety or to ensure adequate treatment, the cost of caring for each individual goes up, and that's a further incentive to the state to say, well, let's find a place to treat these people that is less expensive than a state psychiatric hospital. The other thing that lawyers and civil libertarians did that may have contributed to this, I think did contribute to it, not hugely, but to some extent, was that it was lawyers and civil libertarians who drove up or who successfully advocated for increased procedural protections for involuntary commitment. So that drives up the cost of involuntary commitment, even though it didn't increase the standard for commitment, it drives up the cost. So if all of a sudden, as is now generally accepted, you must have a lawyer in an involuntary commitment hearing, and that slows down the process. In many states, you're required to, believe it or not, have a psychiatrist testify in a commitment hearing. And that's expensive as well. That psychiatrist's time must be paid for, and she or he is not otherwise engaged in treating someone. They're engaged in testifying in court. Then the federal government did give some seed money to states to pay for community mental health services. Gave no money to pay for inpatient psychiatric services. So yet again, the federal government is encouraging the states to treat people in the community, not in hospitals. Yet another reason is one that really applies to all hospital care, not just psychiatric hospital care. So, and one that you all will have heard of and may even have experienced. So all of the entities that pay for hospitalization, Medicare, Medicaid, private insurance like Blue Cross Blue Shield, and virtually any other program that might exist in some state, has taken the position that hospitalization is extremely expensive, and they will only pay for hospitalization for any reason for people who are most acutely ill. So, for example, the average length of stay of someone who is delivering a baby has gone down from when I was delivered in 1902. I think the average length of stay was 10 days. And indeed, doctors used to routinely say to moms who are having their third or fourth kid, oh, it'll be a big burden when you go home to those other kids. You can stay longer. And insurance companies would just pay for that. I'm not saying that was a bad idea. I'm sure my mother didn't want to come home to me when she had my younger brothers and sisters. Who can blame her? So that has all disappeared, as you know. We talk about drive-by deliveries. Well, we have the effective equivalent of drive-by psychiatric hospitalizations. No one wants to pay for more than a day of hospitalization than is necessary, and so we have raised the level of acuity, that is how sick you must be in order to get money from almost any source for the cost of treatment in any kind of facility, public or private. Now, most of what I've said applies to public hospitals. Some of what I've said applies to private hospitals, including the fact that insurance and other things won't pay. Another thing that applies to private hospitals, which might have made up the slack as we went from 55,000 state psychiatric hospital beds to 1,400. Well, you might say, well, are all those people in private psychiatric hospital beds? And the answer is no. No one has kept very good track of this, but for example, in the last decade, we have lost 20% of the private psychiatric hospital beds in Illinois. We went from 5,000 to fewer than 4,000, and that trend continues down. And that's in part because not only are people unwilling to pay for lengthy stays, but the program that is the largest funder of mental health services in the country pays very little in most states on a per day, per capita basis, and that's Medicaid. So the largest funder of mental health services in this country, in every one of the 50 states, is Medicaid, and hospitals lose money in almost every state on every single Medicaid patient. In fact, if you have insurance, you can decide whether this is a good idea or a bad idea. If you have insurance, you are almost certainly eating some of the costs of Medicaid patients in hospitals, not just in psychiatric hospitals, but in all hospitals, because Medicaid underpays hospitals, whether they're not-for-profit or for-profit, can't lose money and stay in business. And where are they going to get the money? They charge more to people who can pay, and that means they charge more to people who have real insurance, that is Blue Cross Blue Shield or something like it. So there's cross-subsidization here. But that discourages private hospitals from, say, keeping psychiatric hospital beds open or expanding psychiatric hospital beds. And indeed, in every state, again, there is a long, slow decline in the number of private psychiatric hospital beds due to the fact that they are losing money on practically every patient in their psychiatric hospital units. There's a couple of other things that one might not imagine. Psychiatric commitment, that is involuntary commitment, is a procedure. And as I've suggested earlier, it involves at least one psychiatrist in most states, or at least some other healthcare professional who will come in to help the petitioner carry his or its burden of proof. So someone has to come in and testify under oath in front of a judge or sometimes a jury that the patient in fact meets the commitment criteria. So as we have reduced the number of state psychiatric hospital beds, we could say, well, we could do this in private psychiatric hospitals. The problem is, in the private sector, who will pay for the time of the psychiatrist testifying in court? And the answer is, no one will pay for that. No one will pay for that. No source. Medicaid won't pay for it, Medicaid won't pay for it, state programs won't pay for it, private insurance won't pay for it. So even if you have wonderful insurance for the treatment of mental illness, and there is a need for involuntary commitment, your insurance won't pay for it. So that means either you have to have rich relatives or the hospital must eat this cost. In fact, there is some evidence that suggests that rich people are more at risk of being involuntarily committed than poor people. It's one of the, whether you can decide whether that's good or bad. And it may be a disincentive. We care about these kinds of disincentives here. So don't make too much money as a lawyer, or you will increase your odds of being involuntarily committed. I will give you the names of legal aid organizations you can work at after graduation to keep down your salaries, because I care about your civil liberties. Additionally, when we had a system in most states, including Illinois, in which everyone was in a state psychiatric hospital, or almost all of the involuntary patients were in state psychiatric hospitals, we had a fairly efficient system for involuntary commitment in the following way. Typically, the court came to you. So in an involuntary commitment hearing, we would have a court actually located on the grounds of a psychiatric hospital. We still have that in Illinois. We have at least 4 psychiatric hospitals in this state, state-operated psychiatric hospitals, that have little courtrooms there. So what does that mean? Why is that efficient? It may not be that efficient for the judges, but it can be, if the volume justifies it, but it's very efficient for the psychiatric hospital staff. So for example, at Reed Mental Health Center, which is on the northwest side of Chicago, where they have one of these commitment courts, when it comes time for an involuntary commitment, the clerk simply calls up the unit where the psychiatrist is working, and the psychiatrist can wander through the corridors and be at the court in 5 minutes, maybe 10 tops. Additionally, the patient can be transported through those same categories in roughly the same time to the commitment hearing. However, if you're in a private psychiatric hospital, the courts have been reluctant or unwilling to come there, in part because the volume doesn't justify it, because there are more small private psychiatric hospitals rather than the few large state psychiatric hospitals. So that if you're in a private psychiatric hospital and that hospital believes you need involuntary commitment, putting aside the time of preparing the petition, which will not be compensated by any source, then you must travel to the commitment hearing. And the psychiatrist may have to sit around all day waiting for his or her case to be called. At least one staff must go with the patient to the hospital, because presumably if the patient needs involuntary commitment, we don't just say to the patient, here, take the train. No, we accompany them, and that we must pay for the cost of an ambulance, which often ends up being eaten by the hospital, because insurance doesn't always cover that cost. Transportation to a commitment hearing, where is that in your insurance policy? It's not transportation to treatment. That is usually covered by insurance policies. So you have at least 2 staff members who are spending perhaps the entire day, but certainly a large portion of the day, away at court. And of course, if there's a continuance, we lawyers love continuances, they have made that trip for nothing. So they will spend perhaps a whole day in court only to come home and have to go back a few days or maybe a few weeks later. So that's all, again, time that the psychiatrist can't bill for, and takes away from the psychiatrist's ability to go and provide services to patients for whom she can bill under any of the remuneration systems that I've discussed. So that discourages private psychiatric hospitals from using the involuntary commitment process. What do they do instead? Well, they make some efforts to get you shuffled off to a state hospital if they can. State hospitals, because they're short of beds, are reluctant to take you. And if not, they often just let you go. We don't have any time for this, we don't have any money, or they turn you away if you're unwilling to be a voluntary patient. They say to the police, take this person to a state hospital if they can convince them to do that, or they simply turn you away unless you are very seriously ill. And indeed, some of the most horrible things that have happened across the country have often happened because persons were turned away from psychiatric hospitals due to a variety of resource questions. Now, I want to make a couple of qualifications that somewhat reduce the stark picture I've given you of 55,000 state psychiatric hospitals down to 1,400. And you may, since you're a lot of smart people in the room, you may have already noticed this. So if you're reducing the length of stay for people because we can treat them better with psychotropic medications, we can treat them more quickly, one psychiatric hospital bed goes a long way, or it goes a lot further than it used to go. So it used to be true that when you went to a state psychiatric hospital when you went to a state psychiatric hospital, you might be going for life. If you go see the old state psychiatric hospitals, only someone like me thinks that's a useful thing to do on a vacation, you will find that they have cemeteries. And you can decide whether the good news is that you would live to a ripe old age and end up in the cemetery, or die young and end up in the cemetery. But that was a very common mode of discharge, is that you died of old age or died of something else. Because when illnesses were untreatable and you were seriously mentally ill, it wasn't safe to let you go. And so we didn't. We kept you for a very long time, often until death. That is extremely rare now. So if you say, we'll just give some rough figures, you can talk about one hospital bed being occupied by one person for a year. Now that same psychiatric hospital bed is occupied by 24 people. People stay about 2 weeks. Maybe more than 24 people, maybe 30 people will stay in that same bed, not at the same time, but sequentially. We have gone to what we call a hotbed system in our state psychiatric hospitals. Now, to some extent, it is sometimes the same person coming and going when we don't provide enough community mental health services, or things don't work as well as we had hoped they worked when we discharged you. But in fact, a psychiatric hospital bed goes a lot farther. I don't think that quite makes up for the fact that we've gone to from 55,000 to 1,400, but it does, at least to some extent, reduce our need for psychiatric hospital beds, public or private. Now, talk about another reason why I think that the original premise that all of a sudden we had a civil rights revolution, if you think that it's a good idea that people are no longer in psychiatric hospitals, you can give all the credit to lawyers and civil libertarians. If you think it's a bad idea, you can blame us. Why doesn't that make sense? Another reason is the timeline. And that is that, in fact, hospital capacity and the number of commitments began declining in the 50s, as I've suggested, and the civil rights revolution didn't really occur until the late 60s and the 1970s, the mental health civil rights revolution, not to be confused with other civil rights revolutions. So the timeline doesn't work. Now, I also think that other recent experience supports this. One, I think, is the example that led me to want to give this talk and to think about how these various factors interact, and that is the fact that we have tried lowering commitment standards, and in fact it has not turned the curve back up in terms of the number of beds or the number of commitments. The number of commitments continues to decline. The number of public and private beds continues to decline. are there exceptions to the premise that moves this talk? The answer is there's at least one counterexample, and you could imagine there being some more coming forward, and the world keeps changing, and other things happen. So let's think about what might happen if I'm wrong, and that people would, in fact, take psychiatric commitment standards seriously, and that they would be the causative effect rather than an effect of other causes. And in order to do that, I'd like to just sort of explain how I think my theory actually works. That is, why is it that lowering the commitment standard doesn't change the behavior of judges, lawyers, and other gatekeepers? And I think that requires us to talk just a little bit, or for me to talk and you to listen, just a little bit about how the process of involuntary commitment works across the country. How do you get into a psychiatric hospital involuntarily? And the answer is that there are all kinds of gatekeepers who have to say yes before you can even get to the point where a court could have a hearing and decide whether or not you meet the involuntary commitment standard. So typically, one way you get to a psychiatric hospital is that a policeman will pick you up. We can talk about a variety of scenarios. You're in downtown Chicago, and you wander out into the middle of State Street, and you're talking to yourself, and the policeman says to you, it's not safe. We'll assume the policeman is a sensitive guy. He politely says, unlike all the policemen that Craig sues, he's a sensitive guy, and we are in the process of trying to train police officers in this city and across the country about how to deal with mentally ill people. So the police officer says, it's not safe for you to be in the middle of State Street. Go to the curb, and the guy says no, or maybe he says some expletive to the police officer. So then what will the police officer do? The police officer is going to solve this problem. He's not going to let you stay in the middle of State Street, if only because it will block traffic, even if he's not sensitive and even if he doesn't care about you. But whether he cares about you or not, he's not going to let you stay there. So he can do one of two things. When you refuse to leave the middle of State Street and you issue the expletive to the police officer, you have committed a crime. You have failed to obey a lawful order of a policeman, or you've committed disorderly conduct. The police officer can arrest you and bring you through and to start the processing of you in the criminal justice system. He can. Or if he thinks you're mentally ill and he wants to do this, he can say, well, maybe you belong in a psychiatric hospital. Maybe you belong in a psychiatric hospital. And he can begin that process. So he can take you to one of the designated places which every police officer is given a list of where you take people who are seriously mentally ill that do intake screening. Okay? And when he takes you there, they will screen. We'll talk about how they screen. Now, we've actually done research in a wonderful woman named Linda Tepland, who teaches at Northwestern, has done research on what affects the behavior of police officers when they come upon someone who they think is mentally ill under these circumstances. And notice that while there are you can think of lots of other scenarios, almost all of the scenarios involve something that would be a relatively trivial, but would be a crime. You're in a restaurant, you won't leave. That's a crime. It's trespass. The restaurant owner calls the police and says, can you get this guy out of here? I don't really want to press charges, but I want him out of here. Police officer can have you arrested, or he can take you to the mental health system if he thinks that's appropriate. So Linda Tepland did research on how it is that police officers behave. She did this research on the condition that the city where the research was being done not be named. She's willing to say that it was done in a large city next to a big lake. Could be Cleveland. And she sent her graduate students to ride along with police officers, okay? So, and then describe their behavior when they came upon someone with a mental illness. And what she found was the number one thing that affected police behavior was their perception and their ability to solve the problem quickly. And by that, did they think, and was it true, that if they took you to the mental hospital would keep you? Or would they turn you away? So police officers know something about the law, but in fact, they don't do legal research by and large, nor perhaps should they. So they learn what the effective commitment standard is from the screening people. From the screening people who either say, we're accepting this person, or we're turning him or her away. So police officers are not going to take someone into custody, even if they believe, because they've carefully studied this and they've looked at all the published cases, that the person meets the commitment criteria if they think, in fact, the screening folks are not going to accept them. Because the last thing they want to happen, and unfortunately this does happen, is that the person gets turned away and ends up back in their precinct on their watch. And they have to solve the problem yet again. They don't want to be called by that same restaurant owner saying, I thought I told you to take this person away. And so if they think that the mental health system will not take care of you, their only other choice is to take you into the criminal justice system if they want to get you off their beat on their shift and not have you return. And it's a perfectly lawful choice for them to make. You have committed a misdemeanor. Almost certainly you have. Almost certainly you have. I mean, if you're even mildly resistant when they try to take you, that's a crime, resisting arrest. So they have the authority to do this. I would just say the most interesting thing about this research is not the results, which I take can be somewhat predictable, but what the police were willing to do, knowing that there was someone taking notes. So here's something that is reported in her wonderful paper on this topic, Linda's wonderful paper, is police officer picks up someone, is taking him to a mental health screening center, which is at a hospital, and pulls off in a dark area, takes the mentally ill person out of the back seat of the car and beats him up and throws him back in the car, and continues to the mental hospital and gets this person admitted. Does this in front of, notice, a graduate student. The graduate student had the temerity to ask the police officer why he did that. I'm not sure I would have the temerity. I would say, oh, I didn't see it. The police officer said, because this person is seriously mentally ill, he wasn't exhibiting sufficient symptoms of that illness to be admitted. That's where he belongs, and I knew he would go in there and tell them that he had been beaten up by the police officers. They would think he was paranoid, and they would admit him. So this is the kinder, gentler police officer who wants you in the mental health system, knowing that going through the criminal justice system is not a great alternative for people with mental illnesses. Or not. But that's the explanation. That's the conduct of police officers who want this to happen rather than that to happen. That's a little diversion from my talk. So police officers can screen you away from the mental health system, but they can't get you admitted to a mental health system. They can drive you to the psychiatric hospital, but they can't make the psychiatric hospital take you. They can't make the psychiatric hospital take you. Similarly, another easy thing you can do, particularly in Cook County, it's easy up to a point, is that between 9 and 5 p.m., Monday through Friday, if you have a loved one at home who you think desperately needs to be in a psychiatric hospital because she or he is deteriorating and is becoming unmanageable at home and bad things are going to happen to him or her or perhaps to you, you can call up the state's attorney. They have a special number. I don't have it memorized, but if you need it, I'll give it to you. And if you can convince the state's attorney that your person meets the commitment criteria, they will say, come on down. And you can go down to their office at 69 West Washington in downtown Chicago. And if you can convince the state's attorney that your loved one meets the commitment criteria, the state's attorney will walk you across the street to the Daly Center and take you in front of a judge ex parte. And the judge will have you sworn in, and you will have filled out a commitment petition, and the judge will ask you whether the contents of that commitment petition are in fact true and correct, and you are subject to penalties for perjury. And if you do that, the judge will issue a writ of detention, and the writ of detention can be placed with the police department, and the police department will go to where you told them your loved one is, or whoever is, and pick that person up and take them to a designated, either a public psychiatric hospital or a private psychiatric hospital is designated and has some state funds. And you can be held for 24 hours while a psychiatrist examines you and determines whether she or he is willing to certify that you meet the commitment criteria. And if the answer is no, you walk out the door. If the answer is yes, you can stay for another 24 hours while another mental health professional must also complete a certificate. So 2 certificates must be completed by mental health professionals in the first 48 hours. If that happens, you will then be held for an involuntary commitment hearing, where you will go in front of a judge, or you might go in front of a judge, and the judge will determine after hearing the evidence whether you meet the commitment criteria. But notice a couple of things. So you get to the psychiatric hospital. Who's deciding whether you meet the commitment criteria? An employee of the hospital where you will be kept, the psychiatrist or other mental health professionals. Now, why might psychiatric hospital personnel have not particularly pay attention to lowerings of the commitment standard? Well, there's a fairly straightforward reason, which is not quite as harsh as perhaps the behavior of the police officer I described earlier, but it seems to me is one hopes, if the psychiatric hospital is operating as well as it can, will force the psychiatric hospital to make some tough choices. Okay? And this was going to be the title of my talk, but I couldn't make up my mind what the title should be, so I abandoned this one. The available bed space theory of psychiatric hospitalizations. Okay? Not that catchy. So assume that there is only one psychiatric hospital in the state or in the jurisdiction, and it has 100 beds, and you're in charge of that psychiatric hospital. And you and your staff are very knowledgeable and are quite good at deciding who is most at risk if they're not admitted or if they're discharged prematurely. Who is most at risk? And you have just 100 beds, and the number of people who are clamoring at the door at any given moment way exceeds 100 people. And you are humane, thoughtful, caring, but you only have 100 beds. You only have 100 beds. And by 100 beds, I mean you have the staff sufficient to adequately, humanely, and safely treat 100 people, okay? Without having there be excessive violence in the hospital because you don't have enough staff, or people who go without treatment, or other bad things happening, including sometimes, if there isn't enough staff, suicides occur. Other bad things happen if you don't have enough staff. So you have figured out, by dint of your brains and your thoughtfulness, that 100 beds is it. 100 patients is it. That's as much as we can take, and after that, bad things start to happen. So now someone comes to the front door, and we won't say how she or he comes, but someone comes to the front door seeking admission, and you're the thoughtful, humane director of this hospital. What do you do? This is the audience participation part. What do you do?
Accept them.
Okay. But now you know you're over 100, and you can't safely do that. You're putting everyone else at risk. So what do you do?
Come up with a good excuse not to accept them?
Those are 2 choices. Any other choices? Yes.
Well, figure out whether this guy's in your top 100 most dangerous.
Yes, yes, which is not different than what you said. You were on the right track. So I take it that at any moment, if you're running the only psychiatric hospital in the state, the jurisdiction, and you have 100 beds, you want the 100 people in those beds that are most at risk of something horrible happening if they're not in there, okay? You want the 100 worst people or sickest people, whatever you want to say. And of course, this kind of decision making is not perfect, but someone's got to do it, okay? So if you start admitting more people, the dedicated, humane director throws the least sick people out the back door while admitting more sick people to the front door. I'm not saying they literally throw them out the back door, but they must discharge them. They must discharge them. That's the only humane way to run a psychiatric hospital. It's the only humane way to run a psychiatric hospital. What else can you do? What else can you do? You have no other choice. You have to use your beds most effectively. So if you lower the commitment standard, you will tell your staff, pay no attention to the lowering of the commitment standard. Here's our standard. Roughly, if you're this way, we can keep the census at 100. You know, of course, psychiatric hospitals, if they're smart, keep a few beds in reserve, but that just means the capacity is 98, not 100. So, because you never know who's coming in the middle of the night and how sick they're going to be, and you don't want to discharge someone at 2 in the morning. So usually a bad idea. Particularly someone with a serious mental illness, it's often difficult to connect them to adequate and humane community mental health services. But that is what you can do. You can discharge people. Now, there are other things you can think about doing systemically. That is, as a general matter, if you realize that there will be more people who will be involuntarily committed, you can say, well, we're going to keep everyone for shorter periods of time. That will make things move more quickly. And the problem with that one, it can work to some extent. That has been what we have done over the last 50 years, is that we have tried to get people out more quickly. But that, you know, there's a limit to what you can do in terms of that. That is, medications don't work more quickly because we wish them to. There's a lag time between when we start giving you medications, and sometimes the first medication that we try doesn't work so well. And this is good psychiatry, we will say that one didn't work so well, we're going to try another one. And as a general matter, as you might imagine, because all medications have side effects, and some of the side effects for medications for the treatment of mental illness are quite serious, even life-threatening, a competent psychiatrist usually starts people near the bottom end of the effective range of a medication, doesn't start at the top, where the risks are higher, so starts at the bottom and slowly increases. If you speed that up, you're going to have more adverse outcomes that would be otherwise avoidable. So again, that's a problem. So it isn't so simple what to do. And so the bottom line is you tell your staff, you know, this person doesn't meet the admission criteria. We're not keeping them. We're not taking them. And of course, police officers are not stupid, so that if every time they take someone to the hospital, that kind of person gets turned away, they learn from their mistakes. State's attorneys are not stupid either. Most commitment petitions are filed by state's attorneys. And if they learn that when they send someone off to a state psychiatric hospital or a private psychiatric hospital, the hospital refuses to certify them, they will say, well, we're not going to waste our time pursuing this. And then, as I suggested earlier, even if they're willing to certify, in the end of the day, if you get to a commitment hearing, some mental health professional, almost certainly who is someone who is employed by the hospital where you are being kept and will be kept, has to testify. And if that person is unwilling to testify in favor of commitment, the prosecutor loses. And presumably, if the prosecutor is preparing his or her witnesses in advance, they will figure this out before they even get to the commitment hearing and will move to dismiss the commitment hearing in advance of the hearing. In advance of the hearing. So let's think about some other things. Why can't the courts just keep committing people? Why is it that you can actually turn people away? In almost every jurisdiction, a commitment order is an authorization, not a command. And what do I mean by that? So every state has some period of commitment. In Illinois, it's 90 days. Some are 60, some are 180. And if a judge following a hearing finds that you meet the involuntary commitment standard and orders you committed, she can say, okay, this hospital has the authority to keep you for 90 days. The authority to keep you for 90 days without any further proceedings. Okay? Following a lawful hearing with presumably due process, that's the order that the judge enters. Authorization for 90 days. And then you go to the psychiatric hospital, and the psychiatric hospital says, we don't want you. They can turn you away at the front door, and they have not violated that order because it's authorization, not command. And if they're doing what you said, shouldn't they do that? If you're not among the 100 most sick people, if they got 100 beds and every one of the other people, so they will turn you away. So that if magically the commitment standard were to change tomorrow, and if the state's attorneys were to say, well, we're going to commit everyone who meets the new lower commitment standard, presumably the hospital's behavior would not change at all. They would just have to do more of it. And notice that wouldn't necessarily be helpful because someone has to be doing that evaluation, and that someone is not treating patients. Okay? So in the end of the day, this can be churning of people. And of course, the most expensive days in a psychiatric hospital are usually the first day and the last day because there's lots of paperwork when you admit someone and there's lots of paperwork when you discharge someone. So if you have people cycling through psychiatric hospitals more quickly, you will drive up the costs. You will need more staff to treat the same number of people because it's labor intensive to evaluate someone who's just come in the door, figure out exactly what kind of treatment they need, make sure that you put them on the right medication if medication is indicated. For most people in psychiatric hospitals, it's indicated. Now, so the other title for my talk, which I abandoned, is If You Build It, They Will Come, which is fairly obvious. So if you really want to lower the commitment standard, build more hospitals. Build more hospitals. I mean, during the 4-year period since the commitment standard was last lowered in Illinois, the number of inpatient psychiatric beds in this state declined precipitously. We closed the only hospital between Chicago and Springfield in Peoria. We downsized many other state psychiatric hospitals. If you think we need to put more people in psychiatric hospitals, if you think that's the appropriate strategy, you must build beds. If you staff them, there's no particular reason why they won't all be filled. I mean, hospitals like to treat people. These are all decent people who want to help persons with mental illnesses. Most psychiatric hospital staff are, in fact, interested in helping people. Maybe not all of them, but most of them are. And so if you're there, so they will take in enough patients to fill up the beds. Now, I will say one more thing, and then I'll be happy to answer questions or whatever. One might say, well, you know, do we have too few psychiatric hospital beds or too many in Illinois, in Indiana, in California? And that question can't be answered in the abstract. So one of the reasons that people end up in psychiatric hospitals, unfortunately, is that people get discharged from psychiatric hospitals. We do not afford them the level of community mental health services that they need. They get sick again, and they come back. So you can answer the question, so given the amount of money that we are willing to or are spending on community mental health services, do we have enough psychiatric hospital beds in Illinois or the United States? The answer is clearly no. Could we spend our money more effectively? That is, if you made me czar of the mental health world and gave me unlimited resources, would I spend those unlimited resources on building more psychiatric hospital beds? Well, I don't know enough about all the other 49 states to answer that. The answer in Illinois would be no. 1,400 state psychiatric hospital beds is enough. If you give me money, I can spend it more effectively by treating people more intensively and better in the community, and then you will have fewer repeat players. We derisively call them frequent flyers in the mental health system, people who come back and come back and come back because we have not treated them adequately. So the answer isn't necessarily that we should build them and they will come. The answer might be that we should say it's too expensive to build them, but the consequences of not doing anything are often not good, and bad outcomes happen. I can give you 1,000 anecdotes of bad outcomes in Illinois that have occurred in Illinois because of our failure to have an adequate community mental health system, an adequate health system. But I won't give you anecdotes, I'll just give you some numbers. So there are now more people with serious mental illnesses in the state prison system than there are in all the public and private psychiatric hospitals combined. And the largest single location for people with serious mental illnesses in this state, it's larger than any public or private psychiatric hospital, is the Cook County Jail, where we have approximately and conservatively 1,200 people with serious mental illnesses. There's no psychiatric hospital that size in Illinois. And on that cheery note, I'll end.